Well, hello there, and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore Presents. In this particular episode, I'm joined by Dr. Kate Cherrell, a writer and broadcaster specialising in the long 19th century and paranormal history. Her academic interests include 19th century spiritualism, mourning traditions, the gothic, the monstrous feminine, and death history. She's the author of Begotten 2025, Memorials to the Dead 2026, and writes commercially on paranormal history for various magazines and publishers. She's the co-founder of Not of This World Festival, director of the Bats Ball annual cemetery gathering, and sits on the directors board of Lincoln Book Festival. As a historian, she has co-hosted Haunted Homecoming, Unexplained Caught on Camera, and has provided historical expertise on the Yorkshire Exorcist, Paranormal, and Weird Britain. In this chat, we talk about the fascination for Christmas ghost stories, where that fascination actually came from, why television plays such a big role in our fascination with M.R. James at Christmas, and where the genre might go next. Enjoy. Hello and welcome to Fabulous Folklore. How are you doing?
I'm all right, thank you. Pretty cold. As much as I love the winter and the whole spooky spectral element that comes along with it, I'm a big fan of central heating, which kind of knocks this kind of spooky side out of kilter a bit. But otherwise, surviving well. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Yeah, like how gothic and ghost storyish can you really be when you're snuggled under a blanket?
I know, I know. I mean, M.R. James is very much enhanced with the application of a thick pair of fleecy Muppet pajamas. That's the true way to enjoy the spectres of the season.
I suppose it worked for Michael Caine.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, we're here to talk about Christmas ghost stories because you and I are
Mm.
both like ghost story mad, which is
Yeah.
the best way to be. It's the correct way to be, in my opinion. And I've got an episode way back when, and I'm talking in like 2020 about why we tell ghost stories at Christmas. So there's a good chance people haven't come across it, apart from the one listener that I know has listened to the entire podcast this year, like from
Oh
beginning to end,
wow.
which is very
Yeah.
impressive achievement. But it's also good to get multiple perspectives. So, in your opinion, why do we tell ghost stories at Christmas?
Right. Well, as I'm primarily a Victorianist, so most of my appreciation of the ghost story and the ghost story at Christmas comes through that lens of being heavily immersed in the 19th century. But broadly speaking, I'd say it's both a spiritual and a practical one, really, because we've got these long established beliefs of the veil between life and death, thought to be thinner this time of year. Go suck it, Halloween. Yule has really got it. With dark nights, you've got little to do, you need warmth, as many of us still do today. Families would find themselves together, they'd find themselves around the hearth and read the popular stories of the day. Now, when we trace this to when it's kind of established as a tradition, that's when we look to the early 19th century. It did happen in the 18th century, we're not going to knock that, but we take most of our ghost story traditions and certainly most of our broad Christmas traditions from the 19th century. So our image of the Christmas ghost story is intrinsically linked with the 19th century. And when we see even today adaptations of Christmas ghost stories, they're distinctly Victorian in aesthetic, in tradition. But it kind of, as a tradition as we know it today, it really started in the 1830s. And this is the age of the Christmas literary annual. So much like I still insist on getting a Beano annual every Christmas, Beano annual and a bottle of matey bubble bath. That's tradition. If not, I'm going to riot. But back then they'd started having these Christmas annuals with a bit of everything in them. And then the ghost story tradition came about. And I'm really sorry, but I can waffle on about the Victorians and like periodical press till I go blue in the face. But the Victorian ghost story, as we know it today, and like the tradition of the festive ghost story, it's a really vast and amorphous field. So when people say, why do we tell ghost stories at Christmas? They've got this very specific idea, almost as if we're putting different types of ghost stories into this like taxonomy, but they do blend. There's no unified structure for ghost stories. And the Christmas ghost story form was repeated year round, realistically, because of the dawn of the periodical press, which changed drastically the way we consume media, the way we consume stories, but also the way we structure stories. So what we see today is the traditional Christmas ghost story. It's kind of through necessity, because obviously a lot of these early ghost stories were published and charged by the word. So one of my favourite aspects of Victorian ghost stories that we see is very traditional today is that realistically you could tell the story in 2,000 words, but they told it in 20,000 because that would pay for their rent for the month. But the dawn of the periodical press, basically the magazine press, meant that we could tell accessible, sensational, and fun stories that were essentially popular genre fictions, and then they could be cut into weekly chapters and they could be enjoyed by multiple age ranges, multiple classes, because ultimately, while we think that society is cut into different classes, different literacy levels, ultimately the ghost story is kind of one of those unique levelers that they can be universally accepted and universally feared across all social boundaries. Um, so yeah, it's a tricky thing to sort of pin down, because literary ghosts can be found everywhere year through. But with the darker nights, with these darker associations, the psychological impact of those ghost stories is heightened. It's like if you want to, it's really practical. If you want your ghost story, your frightening story to have the greatest impact, you're going to release it at a time where people are spending more time at home. They're looking for things to do where they don't have to move about an awful lot. And they're looking for something that's got a universal sensational theme. And so the ghost story kind of ticks all of those boxes. And then I could waffle on about Dickens for ages, but he's got a lot to answer for as well.
Well, it was funny when you mentioned annuals there because I just suddenly thought, hang on a minute. Mrs. Beeton did a Christmas annual, and that was where A Study in Scarlet was first published in 1887. So there is a timeline where we could have had an annual tradition of Sherlock Holmes fighting ghosts every Christmas. How amazing would
Yeah,
that have been if you'd brought together detective fiction and ghost stories? Why is that not a thing?
exactly, because both were massive genres in the 19th century. Detective fiction was arguably far more important than, maybe not far more important because that's subjective, it's far more prevalent and far more appreciated on a wide public scale than ghost stories, because ghost stories were small towards the end of the century as well. They were seen as a little bit old hat, a little bit common, because they were popular. Is that everything always comes through to this kind of snobbishness within genre fiction, but detective fiction just snowballed. But they were also far too long and yeah, a bit rambling at times. But I am disappointed we don't have that real tradition of Sherlock Holmes and a thousand things to do with a pound of mince at Christmas. I think maybe Mrs. Beeton could do with being far more celebrated.
And I know you mentioned about Halloween can suck it, and I did want to ask the question that do you
Mm,
think that Christmas is actually a better time of year for ghost stories than Halloween? I do, but I'm curious to see if
mm.
you agree.
I do, but I also think this is because I've become I've become very jaded in recent years. I think it comes from living in a very isolated way and just interacting with books and dead people. You sort of lose any sense of fun about your person. But to me, Halloween does, it seems quite inauthentic in the way that I experience it in a public setting. Because it seems more and more that when you go out, you're surrounded by plastic ghosts and pumpkins that are now, even them, like I love a plastic ghost, I love a pumpkin, but when they're in that realm, they seem so far removed from the roots where they would have actually had spiritual folkloric weight, that they've become something wholly different now, and we can't really discuss them in the same breath. And that's not a culture, subculture, an aesthetic that I really immerse myself in nowadays. Um, but with Christmas, getting towards the end of the year in winter, the nights are darker. Halloween can still be a little bit sunny. You don't have this social pressure as well to indulge in overt spooky imagery. And so you can kind of mimic that Victorian experience. And so, you've got these spiritual ideas going on about the veil being thinner, The dark nights, the short days can send you into a bit of a spin. You need to be indoors and warm. Your whole routine is upended. And an indulgence in a ghost story suddenly seems more plausible as a reality. The contents of it seems far more like it could spring out of the page than at a time when there are far more opportunities for you socially, domestically. I think it's prime time because you can become trapped in those stories, and that really does heighten their efficacy, I think.
Hmm. And obviously, I think we do have to address the M.R. James shaped elephant in the room. And I did obviously mention this before we started recording. Every time I type the word M.R. James, my phone always
Mm,
autocorrects it to Mr. James, and I find that really quite funny.
yeah.
But how exactly did he become so intrinsically linked with the tradition? Because I don't get the impression he set out necessarily to do that, but he has over the years. It's almost like you can't have Christmas without M.R. James.
Yeah. Um, well, I think originally he began an annual custom of writing and reciting ghost stories on Christmas Eve when he was a student at King's College in Cambridge. He was part of a university club called the Chit Chat Club, um, which sounds it's not really my sort of thing, but that wouldn't have mattered because they didn't admit women then anyway. But he would have this tradition of telling stories, telling these ghost stories, and then eventually in about 1904, then he collected his ghost stories that were all designed for the season, if not actively participating in it. He printed those in Ghost Stories of an Antiquary. But as much personally, like I'm not an M.R. James scholar, I'm an M.R. James fan, and I have been since I was a miserable little teenager. But I do think that when we speak today about the association of M.R. James with Christmas, I'd love to say that it's this long literary tradition and we've continued appreciating his work at Christmas on this mass cultural scale ever since, the turn of the century. I really think there's no shame in admitting that many of us think of M.R. James at Christmas because of the 1970s adaptation, the Ghost Story, was it BBC Ghost Story for Christmas
Yes.
series? Now, those I bring out every Christmas, like Muppet Christmas Carol, like, all these sort of traditional, pseudo-traditional things that we now think, oh, well, we can't have Christmas without singing Kermit. And I feel like that's kind of come from the same tradition. Modern media doesn't necessarily have to be dismissed as not bearing enough intellectual weight. Whereas I do think that 1970s series is incredibly well done. Like the adaptation of Whistle and I'll Come to You, My Lad is still held up as arguably the most perfect Jamesian adaptation of one of his own tales. They're done very well. And I think if they'd been thrown together like Crossroads or something and all the walls are wobbling as the protagonists are moving about, then maybe we wouldn't have such warmth for M.R. James. But with it being an accessible media, it's like the periodical press again. M.R. James was made accessible, and it's all about accessibility. And so I think because of like the timeless elements of his stories as well, because M.R. James was a medievalist, and so there are a lot of these, there's a lot of like ecclesiastical things in his stories as well. But through that medievalism, he mines into the most universal and primal fears in all of us that aren't necessarily linked to the time in which he was writing them. And I think that's what makes them timeless. It's spiders and revenants and billowing bed sheets, things that could happen, in the 2020s and they can happen in the 1920s. I think it's that universal aspect that lets them be replayed and readapted. Even now we have the ghost stories for Christmas that the BBC still do, and they've done quite a few M.R. James adaptations, I believe. They did, I think it was Edith Wharton last year. Um, but still, it shows that there's relevance there, and because of that 1970s association, we don't really talk about M.R. James in the height of summer, even if he had been writing ghost stories then. So yeah, I think really we have to thank telly for a lot of it, as much as we all want to seem far more intellectual. But yeah, God bless the 70s.
It's quite funny because I know the thing when you're saying about the the timelessness of these themes, the thing that always
Mm.
stands out for me is the curiosity of the protagonists, because I'm
Mm.
100% the kind of person who, if I found an antique whistle, would blow it to see what would happen.
Oh yeah, same.
And, and I remember I wrote my own response to "Oh Whistle and I'll Accompany My Lad," and it was a woman who was grieving, and she blows the whistle, and whatever the thing is that turns up in the room kind of behaves a little bit more like a really friendly golden retriever. So she ends
Mhm.
up kind of leaving with a new pet. And I thought I'd come at it from a completely different angle of, well,
Yeah.
what would a different kind of person do and react to should they find themselves in that sort of scenario? And I think that's something else that is quite good about his stories, that you can often think, well, how would I have ended that one?
Mm.
And where else
Yeah.
would that one have gone? And I'm a
Yeah.
bit of a heretic because my favorite one of his stories is actually Lost Hearts, which a lot of people sort of seem to just skim over because it's not
Mm.
ghosts. And I'm like, yeah, but it's genuinely creepy though, so that's my favorite.
Yeah, I think I don't necessarily have. So again, you want to say, oh, I like this one that was never actually included in a collection. It was one he mumbled into a wall in 1905. But like, I still love Whistle and I'll Come to You. I st as well. I still think it's those primal fears that we still see reflected in contemporary ghost literature that's seen as so cutting edge. Like, oh, we're talking about folklore in different breaths. We're talking about this fear of change and technology, and we're looking back at these unchanged landscapes as something to be feared, as something harboring this ancient evil, which is an incredibly Victorian view anyway, because they were all most people who were had some element of scholarly experience to their life were delving back into medievalism and this idea of this neo-Gothic past. I mean, just look at the pre-Raphaelites, that's tarting up the past to quite a staggering and beautiful degree. So I think it's that putting lipstick on the past that we still do today that kind of leads us back over and over again. And like you say, we don't necessarily need overt ghosts. Sometimes I think we're spoiled. I think that's the problem with today. This is another soapbox, sorry. But I think we're so used to jump scares and constant gore and these really overt, violent displays and being able to see things, interact with them. Everything's mega, mega tangible, that when we do go back and we read something that's maybe just more unsettling, something that's unanswered, something where three-quarters of it is atmosphere building, our attention spans are so battered from our modern relationships with the internet and social media that we physically can't understand how to process that, and therefore we don't appreciate it. And it feels like we're really denying ourselves these great experiences and these great literary indulgences. So yeah, I think M.R. James, really, we had something in place where you had to read the complete works and you couldn't skip anything. Might work as a kind of like immersion therapy, where then you can find yourself being able to enjoy all different types of literature that you'd found a bit too intensive in recent years. Might do that myself, might start it up as a kind of a counseling effort on myself.
I think it's funny when you say about atmosphere over jump scares, because obviously with
Mm.
my field being film, particularly the haunted house
Mm.
film, and people always go, "Oh, what's your favorite?" expecting it to be one of the more recent ones, and then I'm like, "The Haunting" from 1963, because it is just pure
Yeah,
atmosphere. You don't see anything. I think there's literally two special effects in the entire film. Um, and I just think it's a more successful film because so much is left to your imagination. So whatever I might imagine
exactly.
is making the banging in the corridor is going to be a lot worse than some fella doing whatever he was doing to create the sound effect, which is ultimately what was actually making the noise. So
Yeah.
it is that kind of sitting in between like the sound design and my perception of it, and that's where you get to, populate the world with your own horrors, I suppose, without being too psychoanalytical
Yeah.
about it.
Yeah, it's like if you saw a magician perform a trick and then you insist, no, tell me how it's done, tell me how it's done. The second you find out, it's not going to increase your enjoyment of the trick. If anything, you've ruined it for yourself. And that art of having gaps where your mind can consider things and your mind can fill in the gaps, that I think is something that certainly makes 19th century and early 20th century Gothic and ghost stories all the more potent And we just don't really have that today. Like I wrote a book that came out this year called Begotten, and that's a Victorian ghost story and sort of like a subverted haunted house story. And with that, I deliberately wanted to work with the idea of the unexplained supernatural and atmosphere building and all of these things. And I didn't realize just how much it would rub against what constitutes a modern haunted house story and how we want all of these explained elements at the end. And yeah, I find that I find it very interesting, but I also feel like we're sort of losing an art across the arts in general. So that, film, television media, books, physical artwork, digital artwork, that we don't trust our brains enough to fill in the gaps because that's a really fun element. Books, although you are passive in a sense, they can be incredibly interactive experiences, and I think that's where a lot of the joy of the ghost story lies. And that, like you said, with the BBC adaptations, you can do that self-insertion all the time. You're like, well, what would I do? What would I do? You can still do that within books. You just have to allow yourself, give yourself permission to not know. And
Mm.
that's where the real horror lies. That's where the real frights lie. It's that you don't know and you can't know. It's like tough luck. That's what you're left with.
Yeah. I think obviously one of the other things that I know has been an issue for the recent adaptations, particularly of M.R. James' work, and they've been
Mm,
criticised for their lack of female characters. Although the last one I remember for the Ghost Stories at Christmas that was really, really heavily criticised was actually a Bram Stoker adaptation.
mm,
And I think it was somebody said that was only chosen purely because there was a Lucy Worsley series on Bram Stoker on at the same time. It was not a particularly good short story to adapt, but there we go. But there weren't any female characters in it at all. And obviously M.R. James, it's difficult to find um stories that get adapted that have female characters. And
mm.
let's be honest, it's not as if women don't have a stake in the Christmas ghost story
Yeah.
tradition, is it?
Yeah, yeah. And I think what I've read recently of M.R. James' literary criticism, there are a lot of arguments in that he's writing as a misogynist. That's not necessarily the avenue I'd go down, but there are a lot of compelling arguments. But if you look at his ghost stories, there are female characters, but none of them really have any significance. They're functional. Women are in his stories, but they're functional. They're in the background. They have walk-on parts. They're maids. They're physically unattractive. They're sexless, and that, of course, is something that can come from authorship. And then when you start opening that up, then you've got discussions about authorship versus, literary product. And some people feel very uncomfortable about bringing those discussions into the literary sphere because M.R. James has been considered to be by some friends of his at the time who then passed down their thoughts onto their families, and then those have been reworded and so on by contemporary scholars. He's been considered to be a non-practicing homosexual. But also on top of that, so while he was not attracted to women and obviously didn't have that kind of relationship and that view of women, that doesn't stop you from writing women. So I don't really feel like that should be held up as a great cause of it. But I think when you look at his life, especially when he started writing ghost stories, he was a male scholar at an all-male college. He was incredibly sheltered, amazing education, but this was, from life in a rectory through to Eton and Cambridge. You're surrounded by just men. You don't have interactions with women unless they are serving you, unless they are, house staff, essentially. And so with him being so academically talented, I just don't think he knew enough women to write them convincingly. And he certainly didn't interact with a lot of women. Um, and like I mentioned previously, M.R. James was also quite publicly opposed to awarding women degrees when he was at Cambridge. So he wasn't exactly liberally minded, and certainly wasn't running out shouting that women should be getting the vote. But I think with him being a medievalist and so entrenched in the past and the ecclesiastical past, where you just have wall-to-wall men for centuries, he's doing this within a very male social life, very male academic life. He just had no interest or no need and no interaction with women, certainly no meaningful interaction at the point at which he was writing so many of his ghost stories. So I think a little bit of it is it's a bit of nature and nurture. You know, he writes women in because he knows they exist. He's seen them. He can prove that they exist, but he's no idea what they are or what purpose they hold, which is a shame. And I think, like you say, when we see adaptations today that are so lacking in female representation, it just seems bizarre. It feels like we've just cut out half the world. How on earth could something of this spectral magnitude happen and not a single woman was present? You know, it's bizarre, but I also don't think an awful lot of positive change can come from hacking into M.R. James stories to make them more representative of reality because he wrote them as he intended. And so if we mess around too much, then we completely lose that authenticity and his authorial voice as well. But yeah, it is a shame. I would have loved if there was more women in it, especially reading M.R. James as a teenager, when you're desperately looking for something that you can cling on to as a kind of reflection of yourself. But it didn't stop me from enjoying them or having a few sleepless nights. But yeah, it's certainly an issue, I think, with a lot of those sort of ghost stories.
Mm. So there is obviously, I suppose, an argument that someone should write what they know. And
Mm,
obviously, like you say, if someone's worldview doesn't include women and people of color, then they're not going to include those in their worldview. But I suppose that's where you could then turn to other authors to find where
mm.
you can fill in those gaps. And obviously, there's loads of excellent contemporary authors writing really good, creepy gothic fiction, which is awesome. But which female authors would you say are synonymous with Christmas ghost stories? And if they're not, who should be synonymous with Christmas ghost stories?
Well, again, I think the best Christmas ghost stories are short Christmas ghost stories. And that's not because I'm lazy. That's because I think I promise you I can read books. I promise you. But I think because the form that we associate with the Christmas ghost story is the Victorian short story, so the short story that appeared in the periodical presses, the best way to appreciate the ghost story is kind of like a condensed hit, is to look back into periodical publishing, where there was a lot of female writers, just of general fiction, but certainly with ghost stories, supernatural sensation fiction. There's some amazing women writing there. And curiously, it's between like, I think something between like 50 and 70% of all ghost stories in the 19th century were written by women. So it's this staggering disparity of reality versus what we perceive today. And so a lot of female authors who wrote festive ghost stories wrote supernatural stories all year round. So what's synonymous with Christmas, I think, is rather more subjective. But personally, I think Edith Nesbit is an amazing writer all round, but I think, could be synonymous with Christmas for her ghost stories. That Man Size in Marble was a BBC adaptation last year before last. At some point in the past, I have no concept of time anymore. Man Size in Marble was adapted um, by the BBC, and that is another one as well that has a rather more creeping gothic element to it. It's about atmosphere setting. It's about the trustworthy nature of one's senses that I think kind of people weren't too sure what to make of it. But that and the elevation of supernatural things happening at Christmas or around important holidays is something that she does very, very well, very masterfully. And she also did a story called The Shadow, which is it's all women. So it's like proper tonic to M.R. James, where it's a group of women telling scary stories after dinner. And one woman mentions a ghost that she saw that she encountered in her past, but it's all over now. Or is it? Something is lurking back. So she does these amazing, amazing stories that are very representative of women and women's place in supernatural writing. And I think Edith Nesbit is certainly getting a lot more adulation today by within contemporary scholarship. So maybe 50 years down the line, she will be regarded in the same way that we regard M.R. James's stories. But I think she's absolutely fantastic. And I think if you can stumble through any, there's loads of amazing collections of Christmas ghost stories today. I think Valancourt did a really good collection a couple of years ago where there was a good blend of male and female authorship. Still very male, but still we are seeing that women are permitted to be in these collections. But there've been some really good ones recently, so it's worth just getting one of those seasonal anthologies, and then you can see the ways in which people use ghosts and how they use them to reflect like bloody Dickens social conditions rather than just human spectres. They're more cultural and societal mirrors, or they're just ghosts that are scaring groups of women. You know, you get everything in the Victorian era. It's bloody wonderful.
I think that's, I know she's the sort of the era before, and it's not strictly a ghost story, but I think one of my favorite gothic novels was always Northanger Abbey, and I know it was
Oh God,
Jane
yeah.
Austen taking a pop at the gothic novel, and I just thought it spoke volumes that her attempt at like satirizing a gothic novel was better than a lot of the gothic novels.
Yeah.
So I always feel like Northanger Abbey is one that sometimes gets overlooked, possibly for that reason, but it is genuinely creepy in places.
Yeah, yeah. I think Northanger Abbey and Villette as well, um, by Charlotte Bronte. They're both meant to be parodies of the Gothic form, but in parodying it, they sort of just turn it on its head and it becomes even more, even more Gothic, even more um, creepy and masterful. So yeah, I think the women that tried to parody it, because it was the Gothic and sensation fiction, was seen as so, so old. How God, it's so done, it's so trashy. By trying to satirize it, they just become queens of it. So yeah, I'm absolutely with you on Northanger Abbey as well. Yeah, some good adaptations of that as well.
Mm. I think the I know you mentioned Dickens, and weirdly, I think one of the writers I associate, at least with winter sort of ghost stories, is actually Shakespeare. And I know obviously
Hmm.
he's got various mentions in different plays about like, the old tales that people tell at Christmas and things like that. And I always or in the winter rather, and I always wish that at least some of them had survived, because when you
Yeah.
consider how like OTT some of the Shakespeare plays can be, I kind of think his take on the Christmas ghost story would have either
Mm.
had a lot of mistaken identity and things like that in it, or would have actually been genuinely terrifying. And
Yeah.
even with some of the stuff that he does with Hamlet and seeing his father's ghost and everything, you think, I wonder what some of the Elizabethan ghost stories might have been like.
Yeah.
And isn't it a pity that we don't have any of them as far as I'm aware?
Yeah, it's kind of heartbreaking, but it seems to be it's for the same reason that we don't have as many ballads and like early 16th, 17th century ballads that had this root in oral history. So traditionally, like a lot of tales of adventurers and things like that, they were always told. They're meant to be spoken. They're not necessarily meant to be written down because, of course, then you're only catering to the elite, the people that did have the means to learn how to read and write. So I think the amount of ghost stories we've lost that would have been absolutely phenomenal and so interesting, reflecting social conditions of the day, it's kind of unbearable is when you think of like all the libraries that have been lost over the years. It's kind of we have the same, but the world's largest library was oral storytelling. And with sort of Elizabethan ghost stories, ballad related ghost stories, things that were told by traveling speakers who moved from town to town, we've missed so much of our history that once again was primarily catering to the working classes. And they weren't prioritized as things that had to be written down because they didn't serve the elites. And I think that's something else that reflects back into the continuing ghost story tradition as well. It's that it has always been enjoyed, passed on through words or through oral tradition by the working classes. And anything that the working classes have enjoyed has been deemed generally by the more mobile classes as being of less intellectual worth or less moral worth. And it seems that when Dickens came onto the scene in 1843 with A Christmas Carol, that's the time when finally the elites went, oh, go on then. Go on, we'll talk about these ghosts. We'll allow these ghosts because they're reflecting our good side. So, as in, around the time that Dickens was writing A Christmas Carol, there was this time of great social change. People were more aware of the plight of the urban poor following industrialization. And so a lot of the upper classes, people who were involved in the age of new journalism were now wanting to have their moment of quite visual philanthropy and to have this very performative Christian element to their lives. And that could be reflected in A Christmas Carol, where you could see the the children of one was called Want. We can see the good that the upper classes can do to help the poor little working classes like the Cratchits. So I think Dickens, in a really strange roundabout way, outpriced the working classes who had perpetuated the tradition of the ghost story by publishing A Christmas Carol, whose illustrations were hand painted, so impossibly expensive. So by making it this, he made the Labubu of the 1840s, He made the bag charm of the 1840s. So people were, it sold 6,000 copies on its first day. That's staggering, a really inflated price. So he knew how to market it to the people who wanted to indulge in the idea of making social change. Whereas the working classes who required that social change and had perpetuated the ghost story tradition weren't necessarily able to participate until more affordable versions of A Christmas Carol were made accessible to them. And Dickens did write many other ghost stories thereafter, but so certainly Christmas ghost stories thereafter, but none of them had that same impact because it was yeah, it makes me feel quite uneasy, A Christmas Carol. It feels like it's a bit of a makes me feel a bit grot. It makes me feel like a class traitor, A Christmas Carol. It's a very awkward one, but it all boils down to when Victorian social values get involved. That's how we start getting the preservation of the ghost story as a trope and as a form.
Mm. I know I wanted to do some work when I was doing stuff with haunted houses because the American ones, there's a lot of stuff around, and particularly from Amityville onwards, around home ownership and that
Mm,
link with economics. And I think with Stephen King even referred to Amityville as being like a financial demolition derby. But then when you look at the British version, you get this very definite schism where you either get they're in big massive houses where there's like this weight of history, so clearly wrong stuff has happened at some point in the past. But then the working class version is always a poltergeist in a council house. And I wanted to sort of have a look at why that was, but also how the actual use of techniques and whatnot actually creates the haunting in both cases. So it is quite interesting that when you then look at, for me, what is just one of the finest ghost stories on film, apart from The Haunting, Ghost Watch, it goes
yes,
for
absolutely.
the working class option, and is available
Yeah.
on Internet Archive if anyone hasn't seen it.
Oh, is it?
Yeah,
Oh,
I put it on for my
I
students a couple of years ago.
oh God, it still works. I still think it's really effective. Ghostwatch. I think I can't remember who it was. There was a really nice Blu-ray edition a couple of years ago that I indulged in, which is very nice. But yeah, I think that dichotomy of authenticity versus inauthenticity and believability and artifice, reflected in the big old houses versus the working class living situation. Um, it's it's reflected in truth, it's reflected in lived experience, but also, once again, when we hear of hauntings in big old country houses, you think that automatically, whether or not we all have this kind of ingrained prejudice from so many decades of being exposed to media and newspaper media, is that when you hear about a haunting in a grand old Victorian house, mainly Victorian, obviously we have houses of many old ages, but Victorians are preferable because they have that Gothic architecture, that Gothic revival architecture. That's when we have this sort of innate um, believability to us. When we hear of a Victorian haunted house, we go, oh, of course, it's Victorian. Victorians was the age of the ghost story. Victorian was the age of Gothic architecture. It was the age of subverting ecclesiastical architecture and reassessing medievalism to make this sort of Gothic whole. Whereas at the same time, if someone was saying that their council house was haunted, which was a prominent theme throughout so much, like parapsychology and real world ghost investigations of the 60s, 70s, 80s. They were lived very powerful experiences for a lot of people, but because of the nature of the setting, because it doesn't match our established cultural literary ideals, then we automatically go in with, well, it's got to be fake. Why? Because it's not in a big old Victorian house. Why does it have to be in a big old Victorian house? Because that's what the Victorians told us. So
Mm.
it just feels like it's this weird trickle down where we don't appreciate media, lived experiences, reports, anything when it doesn't fit into this pre-established um, sort of stencil for what makes a ghost story and what makes a haunted house. So I think we've got a lot to answer for there. But I think going back to Ghost Watch, I think that's a contemporary masterpiece. I think that should be put in with, that should Stephen Volk's work should absolutely be put in alongside M.R. James.
Mm.
Fight me, I think he's a genius. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think as well because it sort of set the template for a lot of the ghost hunting programs. Um, and my problems with them are legion, and I will not go into them at the moment.
Yeah.
The the fact that a lot of it basically came from Ghostwatch, I often find quite interesting. And I think
Mm.
that's the other thing, just to bring it back to the sort of the Christmas ghost stories, because you've got that investigatory element to Ghostwatch for obvious reasons. And there always feels to me like the more successful Christmas ghost stories are somebody being nosy, looking into something,
Yeah.
being maybe somewhere that they shouldn't be,
Mm.
or which is where I guess in a way Scrooge is invited to do that in his own life in a way, which is
Yeah.
interesting that he sort of massively predates Freud by quite some margin. Um, and I must admit, I do quite like A Christmas Carol because I always kind of think every year it's like, come on, there's umpteen trillionaires you can have a go at. Now's your time. You're on.
Yeah.
There's always a tiny part of me hoping for that.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
but where was I going with that? Yeah, so it's the curiosity and so on,
Yeah.
and what have you. So based on that, and obviously the difference with more contemporary uh types of horror, although horror's always been cyclical, we'll get another boom of it again in a few years' time. It's always the same. But do you think that we would ever actually see like a renaissance of new and contemporary Christmas ghost stories that are actually maybe set now or somewhere in the last few years, rather than it having to be dependent on an adaptation of something that was written over a century ago?
I hope so. I hope so. I do think we'll, in terms of TV adaptations of ghost stories and Christmas ghost stories, I don't necessarily think that we'll see anyone taking risks on new authors or less established authors, but purely because of the way that TV media is going and is becoming more homogenized. It seems that everything creatively, everything to do with adaptations and anything that comes from a literary background is all just going to be a numbers game, and it's going to be what is deemed the least financial risk. And so we won't get these new voices necessarily for the next few years until inevitably there's some great financial crash or some new network comes forward, like Channel 4 did,
Mm,
back in the day, and they were suddenly platforming all these new and exciting programs. So, like when Channel 4 came in early 90s, suddenly they had Victory's Big Night Out, which for me, once again, one of the greatest things that's ever been produced. Take that, again, fight me. Um, but I think that attitude, much like so many other things, is cyclical. We haven't seen it for a long time, and I don't think we're really far enough round that circle for it to come back. However, in terms of written stories, I think we're in a really interesting space in terms of publishing at the minute. Publishing's far more accessible now. There's some amazing small presses out there, small presses that were pretty much strangled in the late 80s when the horror paperback boom sadly came to an end. These small presses are blooming up again, and they're starting to just focus on things like horror fiction, speculative fiction, things that had previously been deemed as pretty much dead in the water. So we're getting a lot more seasonal anthologies and the encouragement of the writing of short stories as well. It seemed like years ago in every magazine there was a space for fiction, whether that was romantic fiction, ghost stories, whatever. There was always space for some creative writing, and that seems to have been squeezed out of a lot of print media, which is a terrible shame because once again, it has a negative reflection on the wider experience of the arts. Um, and so I think the loss of the magazine press, in the same way as it was 20 odd years ago, or certainly pre-internet, has had a massive negative um, impact on the public realm of genre fiction because now we have next to nothing left. So anthologies, rather than magazine presses, they introduce more people to short form content, which really nurtures the ghost story and really nurtures horror stories and genre fiction and marginalized fiction. So there are so many anthologies that will do queer horror, that will do different types of indigenous horror. There's really, really interesting facets that are being nurtured now. And more people seem to be willing to take a gamble on unknown authors, unknown presses, and new anthologies because they're promising something new, but within quite an interesting, underrepresented genre as well. So I really think we're going to see that renaissance in print literature. I think we're seeing it now. I really think we are. There's new presses appearing all the time that aren't just putting out their mates' work that they didn't bother editing. They're putting out good quality, really interesting, new and exciting fiction. And I think that can only lead to a really rich arts world. But as with everything, there's not a lot of money in it. So we'll just have to see how that leads. Be nice if people bought more books. There you go.
Yeah. Well, if anyone's looking for an anthology of Indigenous horror in particular, and I'm very aware of how awful my camera looks at the minute because it's gotten so dark here already. It seems very atmospheric. But Never Whistle at Night is a really good anthology just of sort of the title calls it dark fiction by
Mhm.
Indigenous authors, and that's really interesting for the way the stories are structured in some cases. But they're also approaching folklore that obviously people outside of Indigenous communities just would never have encountered before. And it's quite nice to read them actually from the authors in those cultures rather than the awful take that you get from writers outside of the community where it's just, what's the word I'm looking for? It's like a really, really bad remix, I think, a lot of the time,
Mhm.
when it's by someone who's not sort of steeped in that culture. And of course, obviously, we've got to reckon with the slop being thrown out by AI, but I think
Oh.
there seems to be enough of a backlash against that I'm almost hoping for like a modern arts and crafts movement where people actually want to have something
Mm.
that's human made to prove it's human made. Because I read it was just a post on Facebook, and somebody was saying that when you look at the jump between 1970s pop to 1980s hip hop, I wish I knew who I'd read this from because it's a really good point. There's no way you could have predicted 80s hip hop off the back of 70s pop. So if you trained an algorithm just on 70s pop, all it would ever produce is more 70s pop. It couldn't do anything else because it can't innovate.
Mm.
Whereas a human will just go, oh, I wonder what'll happen if I do that. Or like will mix things together in a really odd way. Not necessarily always for the better, but they'll at least give it a go. Um, so I'm hoping that we'll start to see more people actively going out looking for human-made stuff. Because if
Yeah.
you're going to write horror, you need to write something that is actually horrifying to you, not just what AI remembers somebody else once wrote.
Absolutely. Yeah, it can never replicate the human experience because it's so personal. And like with the ghost story tradition, there's constant cultural and social reflections. And a machine, an algorithm can't produce that, can't innovate. But I think we see that a lot now with the popularity of zines. So even shorter form than anthologies, the amount of people and the amount of folklore institutions, gothic communities, that are producing very, very bespoke, very, very niche zines, some of which are seasonal, is I find it so exciting. It's been so long since I've been excited about new works. I think because I'm so immersed in the past. I think you can get sort of drunk on Victorians, and then suddenly you stick your head out of the parapet and you go, "Oh my God, people are making things. This is wonderful." But certainly the amount of zines that are coming out at the minute that are really, really innovative, that are they have a real sense of place as well. A lot of regional zines that once again are celebrating and platforming underrepresented voices. I think it's really, really exciting. Again, it's a great thing, but yeah, the amount of money I spend nowadays just being like, oh, that looks interesting. Oh, that looks interesting. Oh, wait, I've got to eat. Oh, damn. You know, it's super noodles again. But look at this zine I've got about sexy Krampus. It's all that sort of thing. But it's an exciting time.
And then finally, and this is, I think, just a bit of a thought experiment more than anything.
Mhm,
We were talking about films earlier, and
mhm.
I think anyone who's listened to the podcast for any length of time will know that I've got a long and deep-seated hatred of romance films and
Right.
musicals, but mostly romance films.
Yeah.
And I was wondering what you thought was more realistic, the Christmas ghost story or
Mhm.
the Christmas romance films in which the couple gets together just because it's the festive season and it's gonna snow. Which one
Yeah.
do you think is more realistic?
Um, I think realistic's a very interesting word there. So, like, realistic, undead spectres delivering justice or terror on dark nights. I mean, seems pretty, but pretty realistic. It could happen. Could happen. Certainly in my mind, it could happen. Or high-flying female executive abandons all she's ever worked for, and desired to go and be the wife of a candy cane maker who lives in the woods. That, first of all, that man is a murderer. Like this is the start of a horror story. We've completely misgenred the whole premise of like the romantic Christmas story. Oh, I'm going to go and work in Tinserbell Island. It's like you're not. You're going to have all your legs chopped off and thrown into the sea. They're horrifying. They're terrifying things. And I think if they did happen, they'd be some of the most monstrous stories we'd ever hear in our lives. Because these are the worst. These are the dregs of society. Never trust a town that is entirely themed around one season. If Nightmare Before Christmas taught you anything, no good can come of this. And so I think the Hallmark Channel would do well to heed my warning.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a whole raft of seasonal films that I just loathe and detest. Love Actually would be probably number one of them. It
Mhm.
just I've got so many issues with that particular genre, and the lack of ghosts is one of them.
Yeah.
I think more things could be improved with the judicious application of ghosts, though, but that might just
Yeah.
be me.
No, no, I think you're right. I mean, I can't, one of my least favorite films, and I really don't like criticizing a lot of media, but the film Nativity.
Thankfully, I don't
The,
know that
it's
one.
like a modern comedy. Martin Freeman's in it. It's like a school nativity that sort of goes haywire. I think that would be vastly improved with the application of a poltergeist. So maybe that's the way. Maybe this is the only way that we can get good AI, which I don't think is a real thing anyway. But maybe if we, crowdfunded some really good graphics people to just go and take all the films we loathe and just whack a demon in it, see what happens. Maybe then we'd not only create a new genre, but we'd finally enjoy Love Actually. Could happen.
It was quite funny actually in my last chat. Sean was saying how much she loves Christmas rom-coms, but also
Mhm.
loves good folk horror. So we decided that what we really need is something like Shaun of the Dead, which was billed as a zombie rom-com, but at
Yes.
Christmas. So I feel like that needs to happen. More
Yeah.
festive zombie films.
Yeah. Yeah. So I can get on board with that. I think what if the Wicker Man was just made out of candy canes? Wouldn't that be magic? That'd be lovely. Christopher Lee with a little Santa hat on. Wonderful. Classic of the season. Let's do that.
Yeah, what could go wrong?
Yeah, exactly. Oh, it'd be terrible. It'd be even worse. All the melting sugar. Oh, I'll take it back.
I
Take it
was
back.
gonna
That's a
say that would
horrific
actually be
idea.
more horrifying because it
Yeah,
would
it
stick
really
to you.
would. I'm sorry, that would be too bad even for an 18. I'd be like Terrifier would bend down to us. That'd be horrific. Yeah, maybe not. Maybe not.
Well, before we go off on that tangent, what are you working on now, and where can people find you?
I'm currently working on a book about seances because ghosts are my bread and butter. So I'm doing that. My book Begotten came out earlier this year. That's a ghost story with a twist, and it's set in the past because I refuse to admit that I live in the 21st century. And that's perfect for this time of year as well. So Begotten, you can get it from wherever you want to purchase books. I've got a book about graves coming out in April called Memorials to the Dead. I don't know if it's up for pre-order yet, but it will be imminently. And that was a really fun thing where I managed to justify going around England, seeing some of the most unusual gravestones, and then turning it into a travel log of sorts.
Excellent.
So that's been good because I've been running my website, burialsandbeyond.com, for donkey's years now. So it's kind of a bit of a story of that as well. I also create stuff all the time on my Patreon, which is patreon.com/burialsandbeyond. And when I say all types of stuff, it's everything from daft, chatty podcasts to in-depth looks at Victorian mediums to word searches based around haunted castles. So when I say there's something for everyone, there really is. There really is. It's, there's a bit of everything there. And I'm all over social media like a moss. So you can find me under Burials and Beyond, or my Instagram is all my own teeth. So I'm really making it easy to have a consistent online presence by using several different monikers. But everything I write about, everything I do is under the same sort of miserable but light-hearted umbrella. So follow me on any of that if you want any more of my nonsense.
Excellent. I highly recommend people following you. And I'm also, as I say again, just looking at how dark it's gotten on my screen, and I'm genuinely expecting something
Yeah.
to appear through that door any minute now. Yay. But yeah, it's been absolutely fabulous talking to you. I love talking about all things ghosts with fellow enthusiasts. Do we have a name? I don't know. What would you call a collection
Um,
of people who love ghost stories?
I just say ghost botherers. Yeah, I think so. Spectral aficionados, maybe.
Mm,
It's not very snappy, is it?
yeah.
Yeah.
I just really hate the idea of like the whole word ghost hunter because I sort of think you're
Mm.
not going out with a crossbow though, are you? So,
All Victorians did. So
well,
Captain
shit,
Marryat tried to get a ghost with a massive gun. So
because that's always been proven to work.
yeah, really wasn't successful. But God loves a trier, so more power to him.
Yeah, the thought was there.
Yeah, yeah. And that's what matters at this time of year. We
It's the
do
thought
well
that
to
counts.
remember. Exactly. Whether it's a bad pair of socks or a massive gun and a ghost, it's the thought that counts.
Well, on that note, it's been marvelous chatting to you.
And you, thank you for having me.
Well, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, feel free to leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts because that helps other people find the show too. It also takes between 4 and 6 hours to research, write, record, and edit these episodes, so if you want to help support my time in doing that, then you can buy me a coffee. Or you can join the Fabulous Folklore family on Patreon and enjoy extra benefits, including exclusive episodes and articles, and even illustrated talks. All the links you need are below, and thanks in advance.